Bram Huxley yanked the fence post out of the ground with both hands and hurled it sideways, like it weighed nothing. "You think this is a farm?" He swept his arm across Tamsin's property, voice loud enough for every man behind him to hear. "Look at it, look at her." His hired hands laughed. One of them didn't even bother hiding it. Tamsin stood 12 feet away, hands still wrapped around a shovel handle, sweat-cutting lines through the dust on her face. She didn't move, didn't speak, just held the shovel and looked at the man who had just dismantled 3 hours of her morning work in about 4 seconds. Bram wasn't finished. 8 days, he said, stepping closer, dropping his voice just enough to make it worse. "That examiner comes in 8 days, and you're out here playing in the dirt with Cactus." He said the word like it was something he'd scraped off his boot. "Go home, girl. Whatever home you still got left." He turned his horse and rode off without looking back. If you've ever had someone laugh at your plan before you even had the chance to prove it, if you've ever stood there holding your tools while someone wrote you off completely, then stay with me. Because this is the story of a woman who didn't argue, didn't beg, and didn't quit. She just went back to work. Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I put out new stories every week, and I don't want you to miss a single one. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Cinder Mesa. The corral fence was gone, not damaged, not leaning. Gone sections of it pulled flat into the dirt, the wooden rails scattered across the north yard like something enormous had walked through without slowing down. Tamsin stood at the edge of it in the gray light before sunrise, still holding her coffee mug, and for a long moment she just looked. She had built that fence in sections over 2 summers. Some of the rails she'd cut herself. Some she'd traded a month's worth of eggs to get hauled out from town. Every post had been sunk by her own hands, in ground that fought her the whole way down, caliche hardpan that turned her wrists to rubber and broke 2 drill bits before she was through. Dark. She had built it the way a person builds something when they know nobody's going to come back and fix it for them. And now it was flat. The horses were still there, at least. That was the first thing she checked, heart in her throat, scanning the open desert past what was left of the fence line. 11 horses, and she counted them twice in the thin morning light. Slate was out front, as always, standing with her head slightly raised, ears rotating like she was tracking something Tamsin couldn't hear yet. The other horses clustered loosely around the gray mare, the way they always did when something had spooked them. Slate wasn't running, so they weren't running. That was the only reason Tamsin still had a livestock operation to protect. She walked the perimeter of the damage in the early, quiet, mug going cold in her hand. The wild herd had come through sometime after midnight. She could read it in the ground. The churned earth. The hoof strikes pressed deep into the softer soil along the north edge the way the fence had been hit from the outside. Nothing malicious, just force. A large body moving fast and not particularly concerned about what was in the way. The north side was a complete loss. The west side had 3 sections still standing, but 2 of them were leaning at angles that would collapse by the end of the day if she didn't brace them. She stood in front of the worst section and did the math she didn't want to do. Timber to fix this properly would cost her more than she had. She knew that before she even thought to check. She knew the price of lumber, the way she knew the price of everything out here, with the particular sharpness of someone who has spent 3 years buying exactly as little as possible to get by. Even if she rode into town today, even if Mabel extended her credit again, she was looking at a shortfall that didn't have a solution. Not in 8 days. Not with what she had, 8 days. The land examiner was coming in 8 days. His name was Aldridge, and he came through settlements like Cinder Mesa on a circuit, checking homestead claims against the federal requirements, functioning livestock operation, evidence of improvements, enclosed enclosure for animals. Tamsin had received his letter 6 weeks ago and had been quietly working toward every item on his list ever since. She was close. She had been close. Now the north and west sides of her corral were open to the desert, and she had 8 days to close them and no money to do it. She drank the cold coffee and thought. The ranch journal was where it always was on the shelf above the small table, tucked between a water ledger and a seed catalog she'd read so many times the spine had separated. The journal had come with the property when she took the claim 3 years ago. Whoever had owned it before had left in a hurry or simply left, the way a lot of people left when the desert didn't give them what they came expecting. The journal was leather-covered and dense, written in a hand that was careful in some places and rushed in others, the handwriting of someone who was figuring things out as they went. She'd read parts of it before, mostly the watcher sections, the notes on seasonal drainage and where to dig. But she hadn't read all of it. She hadn't needed all of it. She needed it now. She found the section after an hour of careful paging, her finger tracing the faded drawings, while the morning light came up through the window. It was a fence design she'd never seen before. Not timber, not wire, not stone. Previous owner had sketched it in pencil with crosshatch shading, 2 rows of tall, columnar cactus planted in an offset pattern, close enough together that the overlapping spines created a solid barrier. There were measurements noted in the margin, spacing calculations, and a short paragraph of handwritten notes that began with the words, "Tried in the ravine sections first, as experiment horses will not press it twice." Tamsin read that sentence 3 times. Horses will not press it twice. She looked out the window at her horses, still grouped around Slate in the early light. She looked at the broken fence line. She looked at the journal, drawing again, measuring the proportions in her head, thinking about the ravine 2 miles east where she'd seen stands of tall columnar cactus growing in dense clusters along the rocky walls. She knew those cactus. She had walked past them dozens of times, pulling water from a shallow well near the ravine mouth. They were tall, some of them 8-9 feet, maybe taller. Old growth, deeply rooted and covered in spines that were not decorative. She had caught her sleeve on one once reaching for a tool she'd dropped, and the spines had gone through the heavy canvas, like it was tissue. The plan that started forming in her head was either the best idea she'd ever had or the most desperate one. She wasn't certain there was a difference anymore. Most of its windows were dark. She ate a quick breakfast standing at the counter, not because she wasn't hungry, but because sitting down felt like the first step toward talking herself out of it. She packed burlap sacks, heavy rope, her 2 strongest work gloves, a digging bar, and a pry tool into the wagon bed. She checked on Slate and gave the mare a long look, the kind of look you give something you're counting on. "Keep them together," Tamsin told her. Slate blinked and said nothing, which was about as much reassurance as Tamsin was going to get. The drive to the ravine took 40 minutes on rough ground. Tamsin let the mule set his own pace because she needed the time to think. By the time she reached the ravine and climbed down from the wagon seat, she had worked through the basic plan well enough to start. She walked the cactus stands slowly, picking columns that were straight and roughly uniform in height, noting the root spread, checking the soil around each base. She needed plants that would survive the move. Transplanting cactus this size was not something the journal described as easy. The previous owner had noted 2 failures before the method started working, but it was something that could be done with the right approach. The right approach, as the journal described it, involved loosening the root mass gradually, not yanking. It involved wrapping the column tightly in burlap before touching it, not after. And it involved accepting that each plant was going to take longer than felt reasonable, and that impatience would result in either a ruined plant or a ruined hand. Tamsin wrapped the first column in burlap from the base up, working carefully and slowly, layering the fabric thick over the worst of the spines. She tied it off with rope and then worked the digging bar in a wide circle around the base, loosening the soil in stages, feeling for where the roots were holding. It took 40 minutes. The sun was fully up by then, and the heat was coming on fast, and she was already sweating through her shirt. She got her rope under the root mass and used the wagon's side rail for leverage, shifting the column in small increments until the roots released cleanly from the soil. She worked it onto the wagon bed using a combination of the rope, the pry tool, and her own shoulder, and when it finally rolled into position and settled, she stood with her hands on her knees for a moment, breathing. 1. She dug 3 that first morning, 3 columns, wrapped and roped and lying in the wagon bed with burlap stuffed between them so they wouldn't shift. She drove back to the homestead at noon with sweat in her eyes and both shoulders burning, and she spent the afternoon digging holes in the corral perimeter 2 feet deep, hard caliche ground, the digging bar ringing against stone every other stroke. She planted the 3 columns before dark, tamping the soil around each one and flooding the base with water from the barrel she'd hauled over. She stood back and looked at them in the failing light. 3 cactus plants in a rough line where a fence used to be. They looked small against the open desert behind them. They looked like nothing at all, but they were in the ground. She went inside and ate, and her hands hurt too much to hold her fork comfortably, and she didn't care. She looked at the journal drawing again before she blew out the lamp. She counted the columns in the sketch and thought about how many she'd need to cover 190 feet of open corral line. The number was not comfortable. She blew out the lamp anyway and went to sleep. The next morning was when Bram Huxley showed up. She heard the horses before she saw them, the particular sound of multiple shod hooves on hardpack, coming from the direction of the Huxley range. She was in the middle of loading the wagon for her second run to the ravine when they rode in, Bram in front, 2 hired hands trailing. Bram was a big man, well-fed and certain of himself in the way that men become when things have gone well for them long enough that they stop remembering luck had anything to do with it. He had 300 acres and a proper timber barn and a bunkhouse with 6 men in it, and he had never once needed to read an old journal to figure out how to keep his fences standing. He pulled up and looked at the 3 columns planted in the dirt. He looked at Tamsin. He looked at the wagon loaded with burlap and rope. And then he smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "What in the world are you doing?" he said, not asking exactly. More like reading aloud from something he'd already found amusing before he got to the punchline. "Working," Tamsin said. "Working." He repeated it the way people repeat words they find absurd. He looked at his hands, who were already grinning. "She's working." "Building what is that, a garden?" "Fence," Tamsin said. Bram leaned forward on his saddle horn and studied the 3 planted columns with an expression of genuine bewilderment mixed with something that might have been contempt. "That's not a fence. That's decoration. Wild horse bumps that in the dark, those things are kindling." "They're not kindling, they're cactus." He said it slowly, like she might not have considered this. "You plant enough of them in a row, all you've got is a row of cactus. Something big enough and scared enough runs through. It goes through." Tamsin tied down the tarp on the wagon without looking at him. "If you say so." That was when his tone shifted. The amusement dropped out of it. "I'm trying to help you," he said, and it sounded less like helping and more like warning. "That examiner comes in 8 days. You know what he's looking for. You need a real fence, not a I don't even know what to call this. Fool's garden. You haven't got the money for timber. I know that. But maybe there's another way. Maybe you lease those horses out to cover the cost. Maybe you sell 2-3 of them and fix the fence proper." Tamsin stopped what she was doing. She turned around and looked at him directly for the first time since he'd ridden in. "I'm not selling my horses," she said. "I'm not saying, and I'm not leasing them." Her voice didn't rise, didn't shake. It was just flat and clear and final. "I'm building the fence. Thank you for coming by." Bram stared at her for a moment. Then he looked at the cactus again, then back at her, and the expression on his face settled into something fixed and certain, the look of a man who has decided he already knows how a story ends. He put his hat back straight and pulled his horse's head around. 7 days, he said over his shoulder. "That's how long you've got to come to your senses." He didn't look back when he rode away. His hands followed him, and one of them laughed at something. The other one said, and the sound of it carried back in the dry air further than Tamsin would have liked. She stood there in the yard for a moment after they were gone. She picked up the wagon rope and finished tying down the load. She climbed up to the seat, clicked her tongue at the mule, and headed back toward the ravine. She didn't have time to be angry. She had holes to dig. Mabel Snow Sutter came by that afternoon, the only person in Cinder Mesa who came without an audience and without a verdict already written. Mabel ran the general store in town after her husband died 3 winters back, and she had the particular quality of someone who had survived hard things without becoming hard herself. She was 60-something and small, and she walked out to where Tamsin was working without announcing herself, set a jar of cold water on the fence post nearby, and watched for a while in silence. "For today," Tamsin said without stopping. "I see that." Mabel looked at the growing line of planted columns. "How many do you need total?" Tamsin named the number. Mabel was quiet for a moment. "That's a lot." "Yes." "How's your mule holding up?" Tamsin glanced toward the animal, who was standing in the shade of the wagon eating from a nosebag. "He's fine today." "And you?" Tamsin didn't answer that one, which was its own kind of answer. Mabel picked up the water jar and walked it over to her. You know something they don't, she said simply. Whatever's in that old journal, you know something they don't. Tamsin took the water and drank half of it. She looked down the line of planted cactus, still too short, still too sparse, still a long way from what it needed to be. I need it to work, she said. I know, Mabel said. That's different from needing it to be easy. She left before the sun got low, walking back toward the road on her own, and Tamsin watched her go for a moment before turning back to her work. She planted 2 more that evening. 6 columns in the ground, maybe 150 to go, and 6 days left. She sat on the porch steps after dark and looked at her hands in the lamplight coming through the window. The blisters were forming along the inside of both palms. The one on her right hand had already broken and was stiffening as it dried. She flexed her fingers slowly, testing the grip. She thought about Bram's face, the certainty in it. The way he had said fool's garden with that particular satisfaction, the way some people say things they've wanted to say for a while. She thought about what he'd actually offered her. Sell the horses, lease the horses, give up pieces of the thing she'd spent 3 years building so she could afford the kind of fence he approved of. She thought about the journal drawing. She thought about what the previous owner had written. Horses will not press it twice. Somewhere out in the dark desert, a night bird called once and went quiet. Tamsin got up, went inside, and set her alarm for before sunrise. She had a lot more holes to dig. The alarm she'd set was a small tin clock with a bent hand that she had to wind every night, and it had never once let her sleep past the time she needed. It went off in the dark and she was already half awake, lying there in the stillness before the desert heated up, listening to the absolute dark, listening to the absolute silence that existed for maybe 30 minutes around 4 in the morning before the birds started and the world got loud again. She lay there for exactly as long as it took to remember everything that was wrong. Then she got up. Her hands hurt before she touched anything. That was new. Normally the stiffness came on after the first hour of work, not before she'd even pulled her boots on. She sat on the edge of the cot and flexed both hands slowly in the dark, feeling the dried skin pull across the broken blisters on her right palm. She had wrapped it the night before with a strip of clean cloth, but the wrapping had come loose in her sleep and now hung from her wrist like something unfinished. She rewrapped it in the lamplight, took 2 long drinks of water from the pitcher on the table, ate a piece of cold cornbread standing at the window, and went outside. The desert before sunrise had a quality to it that was hard to name. The heat that pressed down through every daylight hour simply wasn't there yet, and the ground gave off a faint coolness that it had been storing all night. The sky was the deep blue of something that hadn't made up its mind yet. Tamsin stood in the yard and looked at her cactus line. 6 columns in the gray light, spaced and staggered the way the journal had shown. They looked exactly like what they were, a beginning, not a fence. A beginning. She needed to dig the next row of holes before the ground heated up, because once the sun got into that caliche hardpan, the digging bar rang against it like striking iron, and every stroke sent vibration up through her wrists into her already damaged palms. She had figured this out on day 2, that the first 2 hours of morning were worth 4 hours of midday digging. She was still applying yesterday's lessons to today's problems, which was the only way she had ever gotten anything done out here. She picked up She picked up the digging bar and went to work. The holes she cut in the early morning were cleaner than anything she'd managed in the afternoon heat. She found a rhythm strike. Rotate, strike, rotate. Lever the broken material out and settled into it. The way you settle into something when your mind goes quiet and your body takes over. She counted the strokes instead of the minutes. Counting minutes made the time pass slower. Counting strokes made it feel like progress. By the time the sky turned orange, she had 7 new holes cut and lined out along the west side, measured and spaced to the journal's dimensions. She straightened up and pressed the heel of her hand against the small of her back, which had been sending her a message for the last 40 minutes that she had been ignoring. She looked at the holes, looked at the sky, looked at the mule still in his pen. Then she looked at the mule more carefully. He was standing wrong. It was a small thing, the kind of thing you miss if you're not paying attention or if you want very badly not to see it. His left foreleg was cocked at the knee, the hoof resting toe down with almost no weight on it. Not dramatic, not obvious, just wrong. He had been fine yesterday. She'd watched him carefully on the return trip from the ravine, and he'd moved without any hesitation on the rough ground. But horses and mules could go from fine to lame overnight. She knew that. She'd known that possibility existed and had quietly pushed it out of her mind because she couldn't afford to think about it. She set the digging bar down and walked to the pen. She ran her hand down his legs slowly, starting at the knee, feeling for heat. She found it above the fetlock, not burning, but warm in the way that meant something was happening underneath. He shifted away from her hand when she got to the worst of it, which told her more than the heat did. She checked the hoof for a stone, for a crack, for anything that would give her a simple answer and a simple fix. Nothing simple. She stood up and looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her with the patient, slightly mournful expression that mules had seemed to develop over centuries, of being asked to do more than was reasonable. I know, she said, she could still use him. She knew that. A mule with a sore leg wasn't a mule that couldn't work. Ranchers and farmers pushed lame animals all the time because sometimes you had no choice, and sometimes the animal recovered, and sometimes it didn't. She had seen it done. She had, if she was being honest, done a version of it herself in her first year out here, when the work wouldn't wait and she had no other option. But she had watched that mule every day for 3 years. She had learned his moods and his limits, and the particular way he planted himself when he'd decided he was done. He had carried her through 2 droughts and 1 flash flood, and a winter that nearly broke her. She owed him more than she owed the fence. She let him be and went to find the water bucket. She soaked his leg for 20 minutes, talking to him in the low, even voice she used when she wasn't sure what else to offer. She wrapped it after with strips of clean cloth she'd been saving for her own hands, which struck her as funny in a way that wasn't quite funny. She gave him extra feed and told him to stay off it, which was advice he couldn't follow any more than she could follow the same advice about her own body. Then she stood in the yard and did the new math. Without the mule at full capacity, she couldn't load the wagon as heavy. A lighter load meant fewer cactus per trip, which meant more trips, which meant more time, which meant the buffer she'd been quietly building in her head, the extra day or 2 she'd been telling herself she had, was gone. She wasn't behind yet, but she was no longer ahead of anything. She hitched the mule anyway, loosely, keeping the harness easy, and drove toward the ravine at a pace that was slower than she'd been using. He walked without obvious distress, just the slight unevenness in his stride that she wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't known what to look for. She watched him the whole way. She talked to him more than she usually did, which was something she only did when she was worried and was trying to convince herself she wasn't. At the ravine, she took 2 columns instead of 3, spent the extra time making sure they were wrapped well, secured well, balanced in the wagon beds so the weight was even and the ride back would be smooth. She drove home slower still. She unloaded with extra care on the west side of the yard, rolling each column off the wagon with the rope rather than muscle, like guiding it down rather than letting gravity do the work her shoulder wanted to argue against anyway. She planted them. She watered them. She stood back and counted. 8 columns in the ground. 140 feet of open line left to cover. 5 days remaining. She ate lunch without sitting down, which had become a habit she hadn't consciously decided on. Standing up meant she wasn't resting. Resting meant thinking too clearly about the gap between what she'd done and what she still needed to do. She kept the numbers in a corner of her mind where she could check them without staring directly at them. The way you look at something bright sideways, at an angle, without looking straight at it. She went back out at 1 o'clock and dug more holes in the afternoon heat, which was every bit as bad as she remembered from the day before. The digging bar rang against stone. The sweat soaked through everything. She stopped twice to drink water and once pour a small amount over the back of her neck, which helped for about 30 seconds before the heat absorbed it. At 3 in the afternoon, she heard horses again. Her first thought was Bram. She straightened up and looked toward the road, shading her eyes. But it wasn't Bram. It was 2 of Bram's hands' younger men riding without him, moving at an easy trot like they had nowhere particular to be. They slowed when they saw her working. They didn't pull up completely, just slowed to a walk and let the horses drift toward the fence line, close enough to see clearly. One of them said something to the other. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the shape of it. The other one laughed. They kept riding. Tamsin watched them until they were far enough away that she could stop watching without it meaning something. Then she looked back at the digging bar in her hands and the hole she'd been cutting and the long row of holes still waiting. She drove to the ravine twice more that afternoon. Lighter loads, slower trips. 2 columns each time. 4 more in the ground before the light went. 12 total. 50 feet of covered line, maybe a bit more if she was measuring generously, which she wasn't. She checked the mule's leg before she fed him, and the heat had come down slightly from the morning. Not gone, not healed, but not worse. She considered that a partial victory and went inside to find something for dinner. She was eating when she noticed the journal was still open on the table from the night before. She'd left it open to the fence diagram page, and she sat looking at it while she ate, not reading exactly, just looking. The way you look at a map when you're already on the road and the looking doesn't change anything, but you can't quite stop. The previous owner, she'd never found a name in the journal, just initials T. H had written something below the diagram that she'd read before, but hadn't fully thought about. Note that said, "The mistake is thinking about the gap. Think about the column in front of you, one at a time." It's always one at a time. She wasn't sure if TH had written that as advice or just as a reminder to himself. Either way, it landed now, in a way it hadn't before, which was probably what advice did sat there, waiting, until the moment you were ready to hear it. Closed the journal. She washed her plate and rewrapped her hand and went to sleep. The next morning she was out before the alarm. She didn't remember waking up. It was more like sleep ended and standing began, with nothing distinguishable in between. She dug holes in the dark, with the lantern set on the ground beside her, the light throwing strange shadows across the desert floor, and she thought about what T.H. had written and tried to think only about the hole she was currently digging, rather than the holes still ahead. It helped somewhat. Mabel came again around mid-morning. This time she brought 2 jars of cold water and a wrapped piece of something that turned out to be dried apple cake, which Tamsin ate without any ceremony, sitting right there in the dirt with her back against the wagon wheel. Mabel now sat at the nearby stone and didn't offer any wisdom right away, just watched the line of cactus columns growing along the west side of the corral with the quiet attention of someone actually trying to understand what she was seeing. "They're spacing," Mabel said finally. "The way they're planted. That's not random." Staggered, Tamsin said. 2 rows offset, so there's no straight gap a horse could line up on. Mabel looked at it for a moment longer, and the spines do the work. That's the idea. "Bram came by the store yesterday," Mabel said, in the tone of someone delivering information and making no comment on it. Tamsin waited. "He told Garrett Flint you'd have to sell by the end of the month." Mabel's voice was level. "Said you'd run out of options." Tamsin finished the apple cake. She brushed the crumbs off her work pants and looked at the cactus line. "What did Garrett say?" "Garrett said that's probably right." Mabel paused. "Garrett's wrong most of the time." Tamsin almost smiled. It didn't quite make it, but it came close. "He's going to be watching," Tamsin said. Not a complaint, just a fact she was naming out loud. "He watches everything." Mabel set her empty jar down and stood. "So do I. And I've been watching you for 3 days. You know what I see?" Tamsin didn't answer. "Somebody who's figured out something nobody else has figured out yet." Mabel picked up her skirt and started back toward the road. "That part only works once. After that, everybody knows." Tamsin watched her go, then got up and went back to the wagon. The mule's leg was no better and no worse by the 4th day. She had settled into a management routine with him: soak in the morning, wrap, easy load, slow pace, check again at night. He had stopped shifting away her hand when she checked the heat above the fetlock, which she interpreted as either improvement or accommodation, and she wasn't sure which. Kept his loads light and his pace slow and told herself that was enough. She was wrong about the timeline on day 4. She had told herself she was running behind by 1 day. She sat down that evening with the journal drawing and a piece of charcoal and actually counted the feet of fence still open, the average number of columns per trip, the number of trips she could realistically manage per day with the mule the way he was. The number she came out with was not good. She sat there with the charcoal in her hand and looked at it for a while. She was behind by more than 1 day. If she kept the same pace she'd been keeping, she would finish in 9 days. Aldridge was coming in 5. She recalculated twice to be certain and got the same answer both times. She set the charcoal down and sat very still for a moment in the lamplight. The kind of still that isn't calm but is the thing you make yourself do before you let yourself feel the full weight of something. She breathed in and out a few times. She looked at the journal drawing. She looked at her wrapped hand. She looked at the lamp. Then she started working backward through the numbers, asking a different question. Not how far behind she was, but what would have to change to close the gap. She needed more columns per day. With the mule compromised, she couldn't increase the load per trip. So she needed more trips. More trips meant starting earlier and working later. Starting earlier than before sunrise was not physically possible. She was already in the dark. Working later meant pushing past the point where the heat came back up in the evening and the dirt cooled down again, which actually wasn't the worst idea she'd had. She went to bed at 9 o'clock that night and set the alarm for 3:30. At 3:30, she was up and moving before the alarm fully rang. She dug by lamplight for the first hour and a half, cutting holes in the night-cooled ground. Getting 7 holes done, the sky started graying. She made her first trip to the ravine while the air still held the night chill, loaded the wagon careful and slow, drove back with 2 columns, planted them in holes that were already waiting. By 9 o'clock, she had 4 in the ground and was halfway through her second trip. She made 4 trips that day, 2 columns each, 8 new columns in the ground. Her back was a separate ongoing problem by this point. She had a muscle in the right side of her lower back that had been complaining since day 2 and had now moved from complaining to stating its case in clear and specific terms. She adjusted how she stood, shifted how she lifted, planted her feet wider when she was leveraging anything heavy, and it helped just enough to keep working. She did not think very hard about what would happen to it if she didn't let it rest soon, because that was not a useful thing to think about. Bram came back on the 5th day. He came alone this time, which surprised her. She was in the middle of a trip from the ravine on the road back, and she saw him coming from the opposite direction on his bay horse, riding at an easy pace. He pulled up when he reached her wagon. They stopped on the open road with 10 feet between them, and for a moment, neither one of them said anything. He looked at the 2 wrapped cactus columns in the wagon bed. He looked at her. He took in the state of her, the wrapped hands, the dust that had settled into every crease of her work clothes, the way she was sitting on the wagon seat with the particular straightness of someone who has given up on comfort but refuses to show pain. How far along, he said. Far enough. He looked at the road ahead, toward her homestead. I rode by your place this morning, early, before you were moving. He paused. It's more than I expected. Tamsin kept her hands on the reins. Is that right? I'm not here to argue with you, he said. Something in his voice had shifted since the first visit. Not soft exactly, just different in the way that sometimes happened when a person came back to something they'd already dismissed and found it still standing. I'm saying it's more than I thought you'd manage. It's not done, she said. No. He looked at the cactus in the wagon again. How many more? She told him the number. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him do some calculation in his head, and she could see, by the way, his expression shifted slightly, that he arrived at the same conclusion she had. That's a lot of days, he said. I'm aware. He put his hat back straight, which was a habit he had when he was ending conversations. Offer stands, he said. About the horses. Offer was never something I was considering, she said. He looked at her for one more moment, then clicked to his horse and rode around her wagon without another word. She listened to the hoofbeats moving away behind her. She did not turn to watch him go. She clicked to the mule and kept moving. On the evening of the 5th day, something shifted in how the work felt. She noticed it after dark, back at the homestead, standing in front of the cactus line with her lantern. She walked it slowly, counting, and when she reached the end, she turned and walked it back. And somewhere in that return trip, the numbers started working differently in her head. Not enough. Still not enough. But closing. The gap between where she was and where she needed to be had narrowed from impossible to difficult, and difficult was territory she knew how to move through. She went inside and ate cold beans from the pot she'd left on the stove and didn't bother heating them. She thought about Bram's face on the road, more than I expected. She turned that over for a while. There was a version of her that wanted to feel satisfied by it, that wanted to file it away as a small victory. She noticed that want and decided to leave it alone. His expectations had never been her measure. If she started adjusting her sensa sopra his surprise, she'd be doing the same math she'd been trying to stop doing, measuring herself through someone else's eyes. She got up and checked on the mule one more time before she slept. His leg was better. Marginally, genuinely better. The heat above the fetlock was almost gone. When she ran her hand down to the hoof, he didn't shift away. She stood there in the pen with her hand on his neck for a moment in the dark, just breathing, and something in her chest eased in a way that she hadn't felt in several days. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She reset the alarm for 3:30 and went to sleep. Day 6 came in with wind from the west, which was usually a sign that the day was going to be long and difficult, before it decided what kind of difficult. The west of wind kicked up dust along the road to the ravine and dried the sweat off her skins before she had a chance to notice it, which meant she was losing water faster than she could feel it happening. She took at the start and carried more in the wagon and drank again on the road. The mule moved better still, not full strength, but better enough that she risked a slightly heavier load on the first trip and watched his stride carefully for any sign it was too much. He held. She took 3 columns on the first trip, first time she'd done 3 since the injury. She planted them in holes she'd cut that morning and stood back and looked at the line and let herself count. She counted again. If the mule held, if the weather held, if her hands held, she could make it. She could actually make it. Not with a comfortable margin, not with the 2 extra days she'd wanted, but she could close the line before Aldridge arrived if she pushed hard through the last 2 days and didn't lose anything else. She went back to the ravine. On the return trip, a section of the road she hadn't accounted for a soft patch where a rain channel had undercut the surface years ago and nobody had repaired it, gave way under the right rear wheel. The wagon lurched hard to that side, and one of the wrapped cactus columns shifted, and for 3 long seconds, everything was in motion, and she was pulling the mule right and right in the wagon with the handbrake and trying to make the right decisions in the wrong amount of time. Columns slid to the edge of the wagon bed and stopped. The wagon righted. The mule sorted out his footing and stood ears flat, unhappy about everything. Tamsin sat on the seat and let her heartbeat come down. She climbed down and walked around the wagon, checked the wheel, checked the column still wrapped, still intact somehow, checked the mule, checked everything she could check. Nothing broken, nothing lost. She stood on the road in the wind with dust blowing across her boots and felt the pure, particular relief of a near thing that hadn't happened. She got back on the wagon and drove the rest of the way home at a pace that the mule probably found overly cautious. She planted 4 that day, 5 the next. Her hands developed new blisters on top of the healing ones, which was its own kind of answer to the question of whether she'd pushed too hard too soon. She wrapped them tighter and kept working. The back muscle complained, and she changed her stance and kept working. The wind came back on the 7th day, and she tied her hat down and kept working. By the evening of the 7th day, the line stretched nearly 170 feet. The 2 staggered rows of tall cactus columns ran the full length of the north side and most of the west, the spines catching the last light of the day in a way that made the fence look, from a distance, almost like a solid wall. She stood at the end of it and looked back along its length. It was not perfect. Some of the columns leaned slightly where the ground was uneven. One on the north end had an irregular tilt that she'd tried twice to correct, and finally decided was cosmetic. Spacing was almost exactly what the journal had shown, but not quite. There were 3 spots where she'd had to adjust because of rocks in the ground, and in those spots, the stagger was slightly off from what the drawing had specified. But when she walked up close to the worst of those spots and pressed her face near the interlocking spines, she couldn't find a gap she could put her hand through without catching a spine on both sides. And if she couldn't put her hand through it, a horse couldn't put its nose through it. She walked back to the end of the line. 1 day left. Roughly 20 feet of fence still open on the south corner of the west side. She had scouted that spot carefully. The ground there was slightly softer. The cactus she needed for it were already selected and waiting in the ravine, and she knew exactly where each hole needed to go. In ideal conditions, she could plant 20 feet of staggered cactus in one long morning push. These were not ideal conditions. Her hands were in the worst state they'd been in all week, The mule was improved but not recovered, and she had been working on 4 to 5 hours of sleep per night for 7 days, which had an effect that was showing up in small ways. She'd set a water bucket in the wrong place that morning and then forgotten she'd moved it, which cost her 20 minutes. She'd started a sentence 3 times at dinner without finishing any of them, but 20 feet was 20 feet. She checked on Slate and the other horses. They were quiet in the corral, settled the way horses settled when they'd gotten used to a routine and found it acceptable. Slate was standing at the far end of the enclosure facing the open desert, the way she sometimes did in the evening, as if she was watching for something specific. Tamsin followed the mare's gaze out past the fence line, past the cactus wall, out into the darkening desert. Nothing visible, just the expanse of it, the way it went on until the color left it, and it became shadow and then night. She didn't know what Slate was watching for. She went inside and set the alarm and told herself she had 1 day left, and 1 day was enough. Whether she believed it or not was its own separate question, and she didn't have the energy to answer it right then. She just lay down and let the dark come in. And somewhere in the stillness before sleep, she heard a sound far out in the desert, not the night bird from before, but something lower, something that moved through the ground as much as through the air. She told herself it was wind. She closed her eyes. She had 1 day left, and 20 feet of fence to close, and the mule was better, and her hands would hold, and the ground on that south corner was softer than the rest, and when she listed it out that way, it sounded like enough. It sounded like a person who had done 6 impossible things in 7 days, and had 1 ordinary hard thing left. She would find out in the morning whether she was right. She found out at 3:40 in the morning. The alarm went off, and she was already sitting up before the sound fully registered, which meant some part of her had been waiting for it rather than sleeping through it. She sat on the edge of the cot in the dark and took inventory of herself the way she had started doing each morning. Not dramatically, just honestly. Hands stiff and sore, the right palm burning along the new blisters, the left slightly better. Back, the muscle on the right side had locked up sometime in the night and was announcing itself clearly. Shoulders, a deep ache that had stopped being noticeable because it had simply become the baseline of existing. Feet, fine, which was something. She stood up. She dressed in the dark by feel because she had been putting on the same combination of work clothes in the same order every morning for 8 days, and her hands knew where everything was without asking her eyes. She drank a full cup of water before she touched anything else. She wrapped her right hand with fresh cloth she had cut the last strip the night before and tied it carefully, knowing it was the last, and now she wound it around her palm slowly, keeping the pressure even over the worst part. Outside, the desert was completely still, no wind. The kind of still that felt like the whole landscape was holding its breath, which she recognized as her own tired mind projecting onto dirt and rock and sage. She picked up the lantern and the digging bar and walked to the south corner of the west fence line, the last 20 feet. She set the lantern down and drove the digging bar into the ground. The first hole was easier than almost any hole she had cut in the past 8 days. The soils in this corner was different, deeper, finer grained, without the caliche layer that had made the fourth side feel like breaking concrete. The bar went in clean, and the material came out in chunks that didn't require much persuasion. She had the first hole done in 20 minutes, which was faster than she had averaged in days, and the small lift that gave her was genuine, and she let herself feel it for about 30 seconds before starting the second. She cut 5 holes in the first hour and a half. The sky began lightening at the edges by the time she drove to the ravine, and the road was clear, and the mule moved well better than yesterday, the unevenness in his stride almost gone. She loaded 3 columns, taking care with the balance the way she always did, and drove back at a pace that was still careful, but no longer anxious. She planted the first column at 6:15 in the morning, working it into the hole with the rope and the pry bar, tamping the soil in stages, flooding the base. She moved to the second, then the third. She went back to the ravine for 2 more, planted them before 9. Went back again, 2 more. By 11 o'clock, she was looking at a fence line that was 1 column short of complete. 1. She stood at the south corner and looked at the gap, maybe 3 feet of open space between the last planted column and the solid timber section that formed the corral's south side. 3 feet. She needed 1 more cactus column to close it, and she had one more selected and waiting in the ravine. She drove back to the ravine for the last time. She had been to that ravine more times in the past hours than she could count precisely. She knew the road to it the way she knew her own yard, knew which ruts to angle around, which stretch went soft near the drainage line, where the road curved enough that she needed to pull the mule slightly right to keep the wagon wheels out of the rocks. She knew the stand of columnar cactus in the ravine the way she knew a room she'd lived in. For years she could tell by looking which plants were still there and which spots she'd already taken from, and how the growth pattern had changed slightly since her first visit. The column she'd selected was on the east wall, near the ravine's narrowest point. She'd left it for last, because reaching it required navigating a section of uneven footing that had seemed simpler to tackle after she'd had practice. She'd been right about that. She wrapped it, worked the roots loose in the now familiar rhythm, roped it, and had it in the wagon bed in 35 minutes, the fastest she'd ever done a single column from start to loaded. She drove home. She was halfway back when she heard it. At first she thought it was wind coming back. There was a sound in the air that didn't have a clear source of low frequency, more felt than heard, like something pressing against the underside of the morning. The mule felt it first. He tossed his head once, and his ears went flat and forward at the same time, pointing north. Tamsin looked north. Nothing visible, just the desert and the line of low hills in the pale sky. But the sound continued, or rather the feeling continued, a vibration in the dry air that she couldn't place. She clicked the mule on and drove faster than she'd been driving. She got home at 12:30. She planted the last column in 40 minutes, working faster than she should have, and making herself slow down twice, because this particular column mattered too much to rush and damage. She set it in the hole, tamped the soil, flooded the base, and stood back. The fence was closed. She stood there looking at it for longer than was probably reasonable. 190 feet of two staggered row cactus fence running the full length of the north side and the full length of the west side, connecting at both ends to the existing timber sections that formed the corral's east and south walls. The columns stood at varying heights 8 feet, 9 feet, a few taller than that, their spines overlapping between the staggered rows, so that the wall they created was solid, in the way timber was solid, but solid in a different way. The kind of solid that moved with wind rather than against it, and got harder to push through the harder you pushed. She walked the perimeter of the whole fence, all the way around, slowly. She tested it the way the previous owner's journal had described, testing, pressing the side of her forearm against the outer row of spines to feel the resistance, pushing slowly harder, feeling for any give. Columns held. The roots she'd set a week ago were already beginning to take hold in the teeth soil, and the older ones were settled enough that they barely registered her weight against them. She walked back to the yard and sat down in the dirt with her back against the wet wagon wheel because there was nothing left that required her to stand up, and she didn't have anything left in her to stand up for the sake of it. She sat there for maybe 10 minutes, just breathing. The examiner, Aldridge, was coming in the morning. She had one night. She went inside and ate the most substantial meal she'd made in a week, not because she was particularly hungry, but because she had been running on too little for too long, and she had things to do tomorrow that required her to be functional. She ate and she drank 2 cups of water, and she sat at the table with the journal open in front of her, not reading it, just having it there. Taich, whoever you were, she thought, you were right about a lot of things. She went out at dusk to check on the horses. All 11 in the corral, moving easily, Slate standing near the gate the way she did in the evening. The mare looked at Tamsin with a large, considered attention that horses gave things they were deciding about, then went back to the dry grass she'd been working on. Tamsin leaned on the gate and looked at them all. 3 years. 3 years she had been building toward this specific night, not this exact crisis, not this specific fence, but this general fact of still being here, still being in the game, still having something to show an examiner when he arrived with his clipboard and his list of requirements. The sound came again at midnight. She was awake when it happened. She had been lying in the cot in that particular state of exhaustion that is too deep for sleep, the kind where your body is shut down but your mind keeps moving, running the same few thoughts in circles because it doesn't have enough fuel to generate new ones. She had been thinking about the fence, and then about the mule's leg And then about whether she'd flooded the base of that last column enough. And then about the fence again when the vibration came. It was different from before. On the road, it had been faint, uncertain, something you could argue yourself out of. Now it was definite. The earth itself carried it, a deep, rhythmic pressure that came through the foundation of the building and up through the cot frame and into her bones. She sat up. She knew what it was. She had known for a while, the way you know things you've been not thinking about, because thinking about them didn't help. The wild herd. The same one that had taken out the north and west fence 8 days ago, that had scattered livestock across the valley, that moved like a weather event, not malicious, just enormous and fast, and not particularly aware of what it was running through. She got to her window and looked out. The sky was dark but moonbright, the desert visible in shades of silver and shadow. She couldn't see the herd yet, but she could feel it in the air, the way you feel a storm before it breaks. The vibration was building not louder exactly, but closer, more present, filling more of the space around her. The horses in the corral were moving. She could hear them shifting, hooves on hard ground, the particular tense shuffling of horses that know something before they know what it is. Slate's whinny came sharp and short, which was not the sound she usually made. That was the sound Tamsin had learned to read as the mare's version of everyone, pay attention. Tamsin pulled on her boots and her coat and went to the door. She stood in the doorway. The herd came out of the northwest. She heard them, before she saw them the drumming of it, the sheer accumulated weight of 30-plus horses running at full extension, a sound that was less a sound than a fact, something that happened to the air and the ground simultaneously. Then she saw them, coming around the far edge of the low ridge that marked the northwest boundary of Cinder Mesa, and even at distance and in moonlight, they were something that took the breath, the dark shapes moving in a mass. The lead stallion out front, the way they moved together without coordinating, the way a current moves. They were not coming toward her homestead, specifically. She understood that. They were running because something had frightened them, or they were running because they ran, because they were the kind of animal that had been running across open ground for longer than human settlement had existed. On this land, and running was their first language and their most fluent one. They were not targeting her, but they were coming in her direction, and the direction they were coming in was the direction of her corral. She stood in the doorway and watched and did not run. There was nothing to do by running. The fence was what it was. Columns were in the ground. The roots were catching, or they weren't. The stagger was right, or it wasn't. The spines were dense enough to stop a panicking animal, or they weren't. She had done everything she could do over 8 days, and she was done doing things. And now the fence would either hold or it wouldn't, and she would find out in the next few minutes, and running would not change either outcome. So she stood in the doorway. The herd swept across the open ground north of Cinder Mesa's main cluster of homesteads, and the wooden fences there began giving way. She could hear it, the sharp crack of timber, the sudden release of tension in fence wire, the particular brief chaos sound of livestock scattering. She saw lamplight appear in 2 windows across the valley as people woke to the sound of their corrals coming apart. She heard a man shout something she couldn't make out at this distance, and then the herd moved on. They moved southeast, toward her. The lead stallion was visible clearly now, maybe 200 yards out, a dark dun horse, big through the chest, running with the flat-out stride of an animal that had been doing this exact thing its entire life. Behind him, the herd flowed like something liquid, the individual horses distinguishable only in the gaps between them. They crossed the open ground between the northern homesteads and the edge of her property with the velocity of something that had not considered stopping. The stallion hit the fence line at full speed and stopped, not at the fence, before it. His front hooves dug in hard, the hindquarters bunching underneath him, and he stopped with perhaps 4 feet between himself and the outer row of cactus columns. The horses directly behind him piled up in the sudden deceleration, shouldering into each other, hooves scrabbling, a brief controlled chaos of bodies too close and moving too fast, suddenly asked to stand still. Stallion stood in front of the fence and breathed. He was close enough that Tamsin could see the steam coming off him in the cold night air, rising in thin columns in the moonlight. He turned his head and looked at the fence line the way a horse looked at something new and dangerous, not with fear exactly, but with extreme specific attention. He moved one step closer and reached his nose toward the outer row of spines and stopped before he touched them. The particular stop of an animal that remembered something, even if it hadn't happened to this specific fence before. Spines. His kind knew spines. He walked the fence. Tamsin watched him do it, moving, left along the face of the cactus wall, his nose a few inches from the outer columns, looking for the gap that wasn't there. The staggered rows offered no straight line through. He stopped at one point where the spacings was slightly wider than elsewhere and pushed his nose toward it and caught the edge of a spine and pulled back. He shook his head once. The sharp little shake horses used to clear something away. He walked further, found nothing. The herd behind him had settled into the uncertain milling of horses that have stopped but don't know why. Two of them pressed toward the fence line from the sides, probing at different points, and both of them touched spines and retreated within seconds. A younger horse came forward on the left side, where the fence met the timber corral wall, and stood with its chest almost against the outer cactus row, and then thought better of it and backed up. The stallion made one more pass along the face of the wall. Then he turned away. He moved south, and the herd read his movement and flowed with him, away from the corral, away from the cactus fence, out into the open desert to the east where there was nothing to stop them, and they could run as far as they needed to. Within 3 minutes, the sound of them was fading. Within 5, it was gone. Tamsin stood in the doorway of her house and listened to the silence come back. She stood there for a long time. At some point, she realized she was cold and went inside and sat at the table in the lamplight without taking her coat off. She sat there and listened to her horses moving quietly in the corral behind the fence that it held. And after a while, the movement settled and Slate made a low sound that was not quite a whinny, more of a statement, and then the corral was quiet too. She did not feel triumphant. She was not sure what she felt. There was something there, a large thing that she couldn't name clearly, partly relief and partly exhaustion and partly something older and harder to describe, the feeling of having asked a question and finally gotten the answer after a very long wait. She had been living with that question for 8 days. Longer than that, if she was honest, the question of whether this place was hers in any real sense, whether she had what it took to make it stick, had been present since the day she'd arrived with a claim deed and no one else, and a desert that was absolutely indifferent to what she needed from it. The fence had answered it. Not permanently. Not forever. Fences broke. Droughts came. Examiners had criteria. Neighbors had opinions. Nothing about the frontier stayed answered for long. But for tonight, for this one specific question, the fence had held. She finally took off her coat. She was folding it over the chair when she heard the knock at the door. She stood still for a moment, genuinely uncertain she'd heard it. It was after midnight. Nobody knocked at a door after midnight with good news. That was one of the things frontier life taught you early. She crossed to the door and opened it. Mabel Sutter was standing on the porch step, holding a lantern, still dressed in her day clothes, which meant she hadn't been to sleep either. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Mabel said, "I saw it from my window, the whole thing." Tamsin leaned against the doorframe. The fence held. "I know." Mabel's voice was careful with something. "I saw the stallion walk it. Saw him try twice and turn away." She paused. "Bram's corral is kindling. 3 of the other homesteads are going to be finding their livestock at dawn." Tamsin closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. "Is anyone hurt?" "Not that I know. Animals scattered, not people." Mabel looked at her steadily. "Your horses?" "All 11. Tamsin moved back from the door. "Come in." Mabel came inside and sat at the table without being asked, setting the lantern down, and Tamsin put water on for the small stove and found 2 cups and stood at the counter waiting for it to heat. The kitchen was quiet except for the tick of the stove warming up and the distant settling sounds of the desert returning to its night state. "He's going to come in the morning," Mabel said. "Bram?" Tamsin set the cups on the counter. "I know. He's going to be in a different position than he's been in," Mabel said. "His fences are gone. His horses are scattered. He came here to tell you your fence was foolish, and now his fence is gone. And yours is standing." She was saying it carefully, like she was building towards something. "That's a hard morning for a man like that." "He made his choices," Tamsin said, and she heard something flat in her own voice and pulled it back. "It wasn't that simple." She knew it wasn't that simple. Bram had made his choices the same way she'd made hers, based on what he knew, what he'd always known, what had always worked. He didn't have a leather journal from a previous owner. He didn't have a ravine full of columnar cactus 2 miles from his property. He had timber, because timber was what you used for fences, and that was the end of the reasoning. He's going to need help, she said instead. Mabel looked at her for a moment without saying anything. That's a generous thing to think right now. I didn't say it was generous. Tamsin poured the water over the dried herbs in the cups. I said it was true. She brought the cups to the table and sat down. The lamp threw a warm circle of light across the table and the old journal that she'd left there. And Mabel looked at the journal with the same focused attention she'd looked at the fence, with taking it in, making sense of it. That's the one that told you how, Mabel said. That's the one. Mabel put her hand on it lightly. Whoever wrote this didn't stay. No, Tamsin said, but they figured out something that worked. She wrapped her hands around the cup. I'd like to know their name someday. Don't suppose I'll find out. They sat in the kitchen and drank, and didn't talk much after that, which was fine. Outside the desert was quiet in the way that had a particular quality to it. Now not just the absence of the herd, but the absence of the threat of it. The fence standing out there in the moonlight doing fences were supposed to do. After a while, Mabel got up to go. At the door, she turned back. Aldridge comes at 9. I know, your horses are all in. Your fence is standing. Mabel held her lantern up, the light catching the planes of her face. You've got more to show him than most people who've been out here twice as long. Tamsin nodded. Get some sleep, Mabel said. Even a few hours. She left, and the night went quiet again. Tamsin stood at the door for a moment after the sound of Mabel's footsteps faded, looking out at the cactus fence in the moonlight. Columns stood in their staggered rows, catching the silver light, their spines throwing minute shadows across each other in the pattern that had no straight gap, no clean line through, no path for something running hard and scared, and enormous to push through without knowing exactly what it was pushing against. She went back inside. She did not sleep quickly or easily, which was no surprise. She lay in the cot, with her hands crossed on her chest, feeling the pulse in her right palms where the blisters had formed over the original blisters, and she looked at the dark ceiling and thought about the stallion walking her fence, the way he'd stopped, the way he'd tested it once, twice, and then turned away. She thought about what that moment had looked like from the outside, one large animal stopping in front of something a person had made with their hands and their back, and 7 days of pre-dawn mornings in Kalish hardpan. The animal deciding, in that animal way, that this particular thing was not worth pressing against. That was not nothing. She closed her eyes. At some point, sleep arrived, the way it did when you stopped trying to find it. It was not long, and it was not restful, and it was interrupted twice by horses moving in the corral. But she got 3 hours of something that counted as rest, and when the sky started lightening at 5:30, she was already awake and looking at it through the window with the sense of having been somewhere and come back. She went outside in the early gray light and walked the fence again, the whole perimeter, slowly. She was looking for damage, any column that the herd had contacted and loosened, any root ball that the vibration of 30 horses, stopping suddenly, had shifted. She found one column on the north end that had a faint lean to it that might or might not have been there before. She spent 15 minutes backfilling around its base with the tamping rod, adding soil, flooding it. When she stepped back, it stood straight enough that she decided she was seeing it clearly rather than making excuses for it. The rest of the fence was exactly as she'd left it. She fed the horses and checked the mule, whose leg was very nearly normal. She pumped fresh water and filled the trough and stood watching the horses drink in the early morning quiet. Slate came to the fence gate and stood there looking at her with the direct, uninterested attention of an animal that had decided long ago what it thought of a person and wasn't revising the opinion. Good night, Tamsin told her. Slate blinked and walked away. By 7 o'clock, the light was full and the day's heat was beginning. She went inside and changed into her cleanest work clothes, which were not clean by any reasonable definition, but were cleaner than what she'd been wearing. And she washed her face and hands with the basin water, and looked in the small mirror over the washstand, long enough to know that she looked like someone who had been working outdoors for 8 consecutive days without adequate sleep. There wasn't much to be done about that. She made coffee and drank it at the table, and left the journal exactly where it was. Bram arrived before Aldridge. She heard his horse at 7:45 and saw him coming alone down the road from the north, which was the direction of his property, and she could tell from the pace of his horse and the set of his shoulders that the night had not been kind to him. He pulled up at the edge of her yard and sat on his horse for a moment, looking at the fence line, looking at the corral where all 11 horses moved in the morning light. He looked for a long time. Then he dismounted and walked toward the gate on foot, which was a thing she had not seen Bram Huxley do in 3 years of being his neighbor. He always stayed on his horse. It was a posture thing, a habit of a man who preferred to conduct conversations from height. He dismounted now and walked to the fence and stood in front of it the way she had stood in front of it many times over the past 8 days, taking it in, trying to understand it. He reached out and touched one of the outer columns with the back of his hand carefully, feeling the spines. He pulled his hand back. Tamsin watched from the porch. She didn't go inside, and she didn't come off the porch yet, just stood there with her coffee cup and let him look. After a while, he turned and looked at her. 3 of my horses are still out, he said. His voice was different from any version of it she'd heard before. Took 4 men 2 hours just to get the others back. North fence is completely gone. I'm sorry, she said. She meant it. He looked at the cactus wall again. The stallion stopped. Yes. I heard the herd change direction. He ran his hand over his face in a way that made him look older than he usually looked. My fence didn't even slow them down. He paused, and she could see him working with the word, deciding whether to give it the weight it deserved. Your fence stopped them. Tamsin said nothing. How long will it last, he said. This kind of fence. The journal says indefinitely, she said. They grow. Get denser. He was quiet for a moment. A long moment for Bram. I've got a section along my south range, he said. Similar ground to what you've got here. I never could keep good timber posts set in it. Soil's wrong. They heave in winter. He stopped. There's cactus like this in the draws south of my property. Tamsin looked at him steadily. He met her eyes. I'm not asking for a favor, he said. Stiff about it, as if the distinction mattered to him. I'm asking if you were willing to tell me how you did it. She looked at him for a long moment. The man who had pulled her fence post out of the ground. The man who had called it a fool's garden in front of his hands. The man who had told her to sell her horses and go home and stop fighting something she couldn't win. Come inside, she said. I'll show you the journal. Bram Huxley had never been inside Tamsin Rowe's house before. She could tell by the way he stood in the doorway for a half second too long before he came through, it not hesitating exactly. More like registering that he was crossing a threshold he had never crossed, which was a different kind of pause. He took off his windows, were dark. He took off his hat when he came in, which she had not expected, and he held it in both hands while he looked around the small kitchen the way people looked at rooms that were different from what they'd imagined. She didn't know what he'd imagined. The kitchen was what it was: functional, sparse, the kind of clean that came from having few enough things that keeping track of all of them was possible. Table with the journal on it. 2 chairs. The small stove. The shelf with the water ledger and the seed catalog and the row of dried herbs she'd cut in fall and hung upside down until they were ready. A wash basin. A window that looked out toward the corral. She set the journal on the table in front of him and sat down across from it. He took the other chair slowly, like a man who wasn't sure the chair had been offered to him, and settled on his hat on his knee and looked at the journal without touching it. It was on the property when I took the claim, she said. Previous owner left it. Bram looked at the cover, the initials T, H pressed into the leather. You know who TH was? No. Spent some time trying to figure it. Nothing in the deed records matched. He nodded slowly, something moving behind his eyes that she couldn't read. Somebody who figured it out and then left anyway. That's what I think. He reached out and opened the journal to the fence diagram page, which was still marked with the strip of cloth she'd used as a bookmark since day one. He looked at the drawing for a long time. He looked at the margin notes, the spacing calculations, the careful penciled crosshatch of the staggered rows. He was not a stupid man. She had always known that about him, even when she had found him difficult. He was a man who understood land and animals and the specific logic of making things work in hard country. She watched him read the diagram and saw the moment he understood it, not just what it was, but why it worked. The geometry of no gaps, the biology of spine density increasing as the plants grew. Stagger, he said. Yes, so there's no angle a horse can line up on. He studied the spacing measurements. You can't find a straight run through because the rows don't line up straight. The stallion walked it twice last night, Tamsin said. Couldn't find an opening. Bram let out a slow breath through his nose. He turned the page, found the previous owner's notes about early failures and adjustments. Read those too. He had the focused stillness of someone putting things together carefully, making sure the seams held before he moved on. The roots, he said, once they're established. They don't move, she said. Timber heaves, wire rusts. Cactus just gets bigger. He sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, in the way of a man revising a large number of previous conclusions. It wasn't comfortable to watch, not because she enjoyed his discomfort, but because it was a private thing, the recalibration of a firmly held certainty, and watching it felt like being present for something that wanted to happen without an audience. She got up and refilled her coffee and brought a second cup to the table and set it near him without comment. He looked at it, looked at her. Something shifted in his face that was not quite an expression, but was the preparation for one. I owe you an apology, he said. She sat down. She had not expected it that directly or that quickly, and she was honest enough with herself to notice that she had braced for something more complicated, a half apology wrapped in justification, the kind usually produced when they found themselves wrong about something they'd been publicly certain about, and ready to sit through that version and accept it, because that was what being neighbors required. This was not that version. I said, he continued, not quite looking at her, looking at the journal, about the fool's garden, about selling your horses. He stopped. He had the look of a man who had practiced something and found that the practice hadn't helped much when it came time to do the real thing. I said those things in front of my men. I said them loudly enough for you to hear clearly, and I meant them to land, and that wasn't. He stopped again. Wasn't neighborly. No, she said, it wasn't. He looked at her then. I accepted that I was right, he said. I had been right about most things out here for a long time, and I accepted that I was right about this too, and I wasn't interested in being shown otherwise. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. That's not an excuse. It's just what happened. Tamsin looked at the journal open between them. She thought about day 2, loading the wagon in the rising heat with his hired hand's laughter still sitting somewhere in the back of her chest. She thought about day 5, his face on the road, more than I expected. She thought about what it had cost her to keep going. Past that, not past the laughter, but past the doubt that the laughter had planted, the doubt that was in her own head and did not require his continued presence to keep running. I'm not going to pretend it didn't slow me down, she said. Hearing it, it slowed me down in here. She touched her temple briefly. Not the work. The work kept going, but in here it made things heavier. He received that without argument, which she respected. I know, he said. But I finished anyway, she said. Not with heat. Just as a statement of fact, the way you stated the ground temperature or the water depth. So, he said. They sat with that for a moment, and then the sound of hooves came from outside, measured, unhurried. The pace of a horse carrying someone with no reason to rush, because the schedule was set and the obligation was professional, rather than personal. They both knew what that sound meant. Tamsin stood and looked out the window. A gray horse, a straight-backed rider, with a document case under one arm. Aldridge, 9 o'clock, exactly as the letter had said, which told her something about the kind of man he was before she'd exchanged a word with him. Bram stood too and put his hat on. I'll get out of your way. You can stay, she said. The offer surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him, but she meant it. If you want. He looked at her for a moment, reading the offer to determine whether it was genuine or polite. She looked back and let him read it. I'll wait outside, he said. Give you the space. She nodded and went to the door. Aldridge was already at the fence line by the time she came out. He had dismounted and looped his reins over the hitching post at the road's edge and walked directly to the cactus wall, not to the house. Not toward her, but to the fence, as if the thing he'd been sent to evaluate was more immediately interesting than the person who'd built it. She watched him walk the outer face of the north section, his head moving as he tracked the rows, his free hand coming out once to check the spacing between 2 columns at eye level. He was a lean man, middling age, wearing a coat that had been good quality once and was now just practical. He had the weathered look of someone who spent most of his working life outdoors making assessments, and he moved along the fence line with the economical attention of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for and was deciding whether he was seeing it. Bram had moved to the edge of the yard and stood with his horse, watching without being in the way. Tamsin walked to where Aldridge had stopped and waited for him to turn around. He turned around. "Miss Rowe," he said, "Mr. Aldridge." He looked at her the way he'd looked at the fence, not unfriendly, but assessing the professional appraisal of someone whose job required him to see clearly and record accurately. "I'll need to walk the full perimeter," he said. "Count the livestock. Verify the water access and the improvements record." "Whenever you're ready," she said. They walked it together. She answered his questions when she'd started the fence, what method she'd used, where the cactus had come from. She showed him the journal when he asked about the design source, and he looked at it with the same careful attention Bram had shown, though without the personal weight behind it. He was interested in it, the way a person was interested in a document that answered a question he'd been about to ask. He noted something in his own small record book. He counted the horses. He wrote down 11. He checked the water situation, the pump, the trough, the barrel system she'd set up for dry season, and wrote things down about that too. He looked at the structure of the house, the state of the outbuildings, the evidence of 3 years of consistent control layered into the property, the way work layered itself when it was ongoing and not performed. At the cactus fence, he stopped again and spent longer than anywhere else. "This came through a test last night," Tamsin said. He looked at her. "The wild herd came through around midnight. Took out timber fences on 3 properties north of here." She paused. They stopped at mine. He looked at the fence, then at her. Something moved in his expression that might have been the professional version of impressed, which was probably the most she was going to get from Aldridge, and was honestly more than she'd expected. "The cactus is established," he said. "Not just planted. The oldest columns have been in the ground 8 days. The ones I planted first." She walked him to the north end. "You can see the soil around the base. It's already pulling in, settling around the roots. The roots spread on columnar cactus like this can hold in 5 to 7 days if the planting is done right." He pressed one hand against the north section's outer row, flat-palmed, without the tentative caution most people used. He pushed. The column didn't move. He walked to the next one and pushed that. Nothing. He wrote something in his book. She stood in the sun and waited, and tried to read nothing into how long he was writing. He closed the book. "The fence is unorthodox," he said. "I'll need to note that in the filing." "I understand. But it's effective. Structurally sound, living material, demonstrably able to contain livestock under adverse conditions." He said it with the same flat tone he'd used to ask about the water access, which meant he wasn't editorializing, which meant he was satisfied. "Your improvements are substantial for 3 years. The homestead is functional." She waited. "Your claim stands, Miss Rowe." She heard it, and the thing she felt was not the burst of relief she might have expected. It was something quieter, a slow release, like a breath she'd been holding so long that letting it out took a while. She stood in Horseshoe Yard in the morning sun, with the fence behind her and the horses in the corral, and 3 years of work around her in every direction. And she felt the slow release of it and let it happen without performing anything over the top of it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, already moving back toward his horse because his next property on the circuit was waiting and the morning was going on. Bram had been standing at the edge of the yard this whole time. He had heard most of it. The yard wasn't large enough for anything to be fully private, and when Aldridge rode out, he walked over to where Tamsin was standing. He didn't say anything right away. She looked at him. He looked at the fence. "Fine place," he said finally. The same 2 words she'd imagined him saying, or something like them, though the imagined version had always seemed thin and unconvincing when she ran it in her head, and the actual version was quieter, less dramatic, more like something a person said when they didn't have a better word for what they meant, and weren't going to pretend they did. She looked at the fence, too. "I intend to keep it," she said. He nodded. He turned to go, then stopped. "My 3 horses that are still out," he said. "I've got men searching east. They haven't found them." Tamsin looked at the sun position. It was past 9. Horses that had been running since midnight, frightened, moving in a herd panic they would have slowed down by now. Frightened horses didn't run forever. They found somewhere that felt safe, and they stopped, and they stayed there, especially if the terrain channeled them. She knew this land. She had been walking and riding it for 3 years, learning it the way you learn something when your survival depended on understanding it rather than just crossing it. She knew the dry wash that ran northeast from the settlement's edge and turned southeast 2 miles out. Frightened horses followed water channels, even dry ones, because the ground was softer and the walls gave them the sense of being contained. She knew the broad flat where the brush thinned and the ground was pale. Horses gravitated to open ground when frightened because open ground meant no surprises. And that flat was where the energy of a panic run would finally give out. She knew where those horses were. "Give me 10 minutes, she said. She saddled Slate. The mare stood easy while Tamsin worked. Not impatient, but present the quality Slate had, that some horses had, and most didn't, of being there, with you in the task rather than simply being a thing you were doing the task to. Tamsin buckled the last strap and swung up and felt the familiar adjustment of weight and balance. The way the mare settled under her, the small conversation of leg and rein that started the moment she was in the saddle. Bram had his horse ready and 2 of his men who'd come in while Aldridge was making his inspection. They fell in behind Tamsin without discussion, which would have surprised her a week ago. It didn't surprise her now. She took them northeast first, following the line of the dry wash. The morning had gone warm, and the desert was showing its usual daytime face, pale and bright and vast. The kind of landscape that made small things look small. The tracks in the soft wash floor were clear and readable, multiple sets of hooves unshod, moving fast in the initial section and then gradually wider spaced as the pace came down. She read them the way she'd learned to read desert ground, without narrating it, just moving along the line they indicated. Bram rode up beside her after half a mile. "You're following tracks," he said. He looked at the wash floor. "I don't see them." "They're faint," she said. "But they're there." He looked again. She watched him look and not find them, and she didn't elaborate. Not because she was guarding the knowledge, but because there was nothing to say. Either you could read this kind of ground or you couldn't, and it came from time and attention and not from being told what to look for. She had put in the time. That was all. The wash turned southeast at a limestone outcrop. She knew well she'd used it as a navigation point since her first year, a long ridge of pale rock that ran east to west and made the wash angle sharply south of it. She followed the turn, and the tracks sharpened in the softer soil below the outcrop, clearer now, multiple horses, the spacing telling her they'd slowed to a fast walk somewhere in this section. A mile past the outcrop she saw them. 3 horses, 2 dark bays and a buckskin, standing in the shade of the scrub brush at the edge of the flat she'd described in her head. They were not agitated. They were simply standing, the particular stationary quality of horses that have been frightened and run and are now in the recovery phase, still alert but not actively spooked, their heads up but not high. One of the dark bays watched her come and didn't move away. Tamsin stopped Slate 50 yards out and sat still. She watched the 3 horses watch her. She let Slate breathe. She let the horses read the situation without pressure. No sudden movement, no direct advance, no urgency coming off, her or the mare. Slate was the key part of this, and she knew it. An unfamiliar horse in the hands of an unfamiliar rider would have made those 3 animals decide to move again. Slate was something different, the kind of horse that other horses decided was not a threat before they'd consciously decided anything. Bram and his men had stopped when she stopped. She heard one of the men start to speak, and Bram say quietly, "Hold on," which meant he was watching what she was doing and following the logic of it, even if he hadn't done it this way himself. After 2 minutes, one of the bays took a step towards Slate. Tamsin let it happen. The bay came forward another step. Slate stood. The buckskin moved with the bay, not wanting to be left behind, and that was the moment of the herd instinct flipping from flight to follow. The 3rd horse came after the 2nd, and within 3 minutes all 3 were standing near Slate in the relaxed proximity of animals that had decided the situation was manageable. Bram's men came forward slowly and got lines on 2 of them. Tamsin held the 3rd with a lead rope she'd brought without advertising, and they started back toward the settlement at a slow, easy walk that kept everyone's nerves quiet. Bram rode beside her for the first mile without speaking. She didn't push for conversation, and he didn't manufacture any, and the silence was a different quality from the silences they'd had before, not hostile or cautious. Just two people with their attention on the horses and the terrain. How did you know where they'd be? He said finally. She considered the question. Not whether to answer it, but how to answer it accurately without making it sound like something it wasn't. They follow the low ground when they're scared, she said. It feels like shelter even when it isn't. And when the run is done, they find the first open flat that doesn't have any surprises in it. She gestured toward the area they'd left. That flat's the first one south of the wash bend. He took that in. You've watched them before. The wild horses. Watched everything that moves through here, she said. When you're working land alone, you learn what shares it with you. He was quiet again. Then I've been here longer than you. 14 years. I know. I didn't know where those horses would be. She didn't say anything to that. There was nothing useful to say. It was just true, and he had said it himself, and leaving it alone seemed like the right thing. They rode the rest of the way back, without the conversation getting harder or easier, just continuing in the background while the horses moved, and the desert morning went on around them. But when the settlement came back into view and Tamsin's homestead was visible from a small rise, the cactus fence clearly defined from this angle. The two staggered rows running the full length of the north and west sides, the horses in the corral behind it. Bram looked at it from the rise for a moment before they started down. She looked at it too. She never really stopped looking at it. It was hers. At the yard, Bram's men took the 3 recovered horses and headed back toward the Huxley Range. Bram dismounted and stood with his reins in his hand and looked at Tamsin with an expression that was working through something. That journal, he said, the fence design. Yes, you'd be willing, he started, and then stopped and restarted with a directness that seemed to cost him something, but not as much as it would have a week ago. I'd like to try it. Along my South Range line. I told you the ground is bad for timber posts there, and after last night he looked at his hands briefly. I'd like to try it. If you'd be willing to help me understand the method. Tamsin looked at him. I'll bring you the journal, she said. You can copy the diagrams and the notes. Everything T. H wrote about the failures too, that part's as useful as the rest. He nodded slowly. I'll pay you for your time. If you want to come out and look at the ground with me, tell me what you think. I'll come look, she said. You don't need to pay me for that. He seemed uncertain about accepting that which she understood men like Bram were comfortable with transactions, and less comfortable with things that lived in the space between favors and partnership. She didn't make it easier by explaining it. If he came to understand it, he'd come to it on his own terms. He put his hat back on. I'll ride out tomorrow morning, he said, if that suits you. It suits me. He swung up onto his horse. He looked at the cactus fence one more time from the saddle, and what was in his face now was something she couldn't have imagined 8 days ago when he'd called it a fool's garden. It was recognition. Plain and uncomplicated recognition of a thing that worked. He rode away north. Tamsin stood in the yard and watched him go. Then she turned and looked at the fence, and then at the corral, and then at the open land beyond the west side that was just desert, just the same desert it had always been. Hot and dry and enormous and completely indifferent to what she needed from it or what she'd done to survive in it. The sun was fully up now. The day was going to be hot. She went to the pump and washed her hands, properly, for the first time in a week standing at the pump in the full daylight, working the handle, letting the water run over her palms and carry the last of the grit and dried blood out of the new skin forming over the blisters. It hurt in the clean, direct way that healing things hurt, which was different enough from the other kind of hurt that she was willing to stand there and let it happen. She pumped more water and put her face in her hands and held it there. Just for a moment, just that. She straightened up and dried her face on her sleeve and looked at the fence and the corral and the horses and the land. She went inside and made a proper breakfast for the first time in more than a week, not cold beans eaten standing, not cornbread on the move, but a real meal with 2 eggs and the last of the salt pork and a biscuit that she made from scratch, cutting the fat in properly, letting the heat do the work while she sat at the table with the journal open in front of her. She read the fence section again from the beginning. Failures, the adjustments, the final method. The margin notes she'd almost missed on the first reading. The sentence at the bottom of the last page that she'd read 100 times but Bert said now, with the different eyes of someone who had done the thing, rather than the eyes of someone considering whether to try it. What is worth growing takes root slowly and holds in ways that nothing else does. She didn't know if TH had meant the cactus or something else. She thought it was probably both. Mabel came at noon with a jar of preserved peaches, which was either a celebration or Mabel's version of one. She sat at the table while Tamsin ate, and they talked in the easy way of two people who didn't need to fill the silence but were glad to have the company. Mabel had heard about Aldridge's visit from the settlement's general consensus, which had formed within an hour of his departure the way consensus formed in small settlements: fast, thorough, and marginally accurate. "They're saying you built the best fence in Cinder Mesa," Mabel said. "They said it was a fool's garden 4 days ago," Tamsin said. "People update their opinions when they have something to update them with." Mabel looked at the preserved peaches Tamsin was eating. "Also, Bram's fence is gone and yours is standing, and people adjust to visible facts faster than they adjust to anything else." Tamsin ate a peach and thought about that. "Garrett Flint came by the store this morning," Mabel continued. "He wanted to know if you'd be taking on any paid work." Fence consultation. She said it with the particular dryness she used when she found something amusing, but was being measured about showing it. Tamsin looked at her. "He said it as if he'd come up with the idea," Mabel said. Tamsin almost laughed. It came up on her unexpectedly, not the full thing, but the edge of it, the first real edge of genuine humor she'd felt in more than a week, and it was slightly disorienting to notice it. She covered it by taking another bite of peach. "What did you tell him?" she said. "Told him you were busy." Mabel folded her hands on the table. "You can tell him whatever you want when you're ready." She would tell him yes, eventually. She had already decided that somewhere in the back of her mind, though she hadn't consciously named it yet. The knowledge in the journal, and the knowledge in her hands from 8 days of doing it, that wasn't something to keep in a box. It was the kind of thing that had value precisely because it worked. And things that worked in country like this needed to spread. She thought about TH again, someone who had figured it out and left, who had set the journal on the shelf and walked away from a claim that hadn't held but had left the method behind. She had benefited from that entirely by accident, entirely because she'd needed to read the whole journal rather than just the water sections, entirely because she'd been desperate enough to look at an old drawing and think, maybe. That was the thing about useful knowledge. It didn't belong to the person who found it any the more. Water belonged to the first person who found the well. You could hold it, or you could let it move, and out here, in country's hard. Knowledge that moved was the only kind that actually served its purpose. She ate the last of the peaches and sat at the table in the afternoon quiet while Mabel talked about the store and the coming season's supply run and the state of the road north, which had apparently deteriorated significantly, and nobody was doing anything about it. Outside through the window, the cactus columns stood in their staggered rows in the afternoon heat. They would stand through the coming summer, through the dry season, through next winter. The ones she'd planted first were already settled in their ground, the roots spreading slowly through the native soil, finding the channels of moisture that existed even in desert Kalish if you went deep enough. In a year, the spines would be denser. In 2 years, the columns would be taller. In 5 years, the fence she had built in 8 days of desperate work would look like something that had always been there, something the land had produced on its own terms, and people who hadn't seen the broken fence and the borrowed journal and the lameness and the blisters would look at it and think it had been easy. It had not been easy. That was the part that didn't show, and she had decided she was all right with that. The doing of it was hers. The knowing of how it felt to do it was hers. Nobody needed to see the blisters to benefit from the fence. She could hold that and let the rest move. The day after Aldridge rode out, Tamsin slept until 6. It was the latest she'd slept in 9 days, and she woke with the particular disorientation of someone whose body had been running on emergency fuel for so long that returning to normal felt wrong. The light in the room was already yellow and warm. The birds were past their first morning round, and the desert outside was the version of itself that existed after the best hours of cool had already passed. She lay there for a moment and took stock, the way she'd been doing every morning, and found that everything still hurt, but in a different register, not the sharp operational hurt of something that needed attention before she could work, but the duller ache of things beginning to repair themselves. Her hands were the clearest indicator. The blisters had closed overnight on both palms, the skin pulling tight over the new tissue underneath. She flexed them slowly, fingers spreading and closing, and felt the pull of it without the burn. It was progress, small, unglamorous progress of the kind that didn't show on any document or examiner's checklist, but was as real as anything Aldridge had written down. She got up and made coffee and stood at the window while it heated. The fence was there. In the morning light, it was different from any other version of itself. She'd seen not the moonlit shape of the night the herd came through, not the pre-dawn shadow she'd walked alongside with a lantern, not the thing she'd measured and checked and doubted and measured again. In this light, it was simply a feature of the property, the same way the pump and the outbuildings and the corral were features. It had stopped being a project and become a place. She noticed that and filed it away somewhere quiet. Bram came at 8, as he'd said. He came alone again, which, she had started to understand, was his way of signaling something. When he brought his hands, it was a performance, a show of force or status or certainty. And when he came alone, it meant the conversation he was coming for was one he hadn't already decided the outcome of. She met him at the yard fence, and they walked to the cactus wall together, and she spent an hour going through the method with him directly, not from the journal, but from what she knew now, the accumulated knowledge of 8 days of doing it wrong first and then right. She told him about the roots, about wrapping before touching, about the holes needing to be cut in the cool hours if the soil was caliche, because the heat changed how the material came out and left the sides crumbling rather than clean. She told him about the stagger angle and why the measurements in the journal were minimum tolerances rather than exact specifications go wider. And you lost density, go tighter, and you crowded the root spread, and the plants competed instead of consolidating. She told him about the mule, not as a warning exactly, more as context. Anything that goes lame is going to change your timeline, she said. Plan for it changing. Don't build a schedule that requires everything to work perfectly. Quiet for a moment. Did you? Plan for it? No, she said. That's why I'm telling you, he almost smiled. It didn't quite form, but the materials were there. She lent him the journal for the afternoon, so he could copy the diagrams. He returned it before dark, the copies made in his own handwriting in a new notebook, careful and exact, the kind of copying a person did when they took the source material seriously. He left the journal on her porch step without knocking, which she found when she went to check on the horses in the evening. He had left a folded note on top of it that said, "Thank you, BH." She put the note inside the journal's front cover without deciding to, the same way you kept things that felt like they might matter later, without being able to say exactly why. The first week after the examination passed in a way she hadn't expected, not with relief or celebration, but with a kind of recalibration that felt almost like starting over, except that she knew much more this time. The fence required maintenance checks. She walked it every morning, not because she expected to find damage, but because knowing a thing and monitoring it were different, and the fence had earned its monitoring. She checked root soil, checked column lean, added water to the bases of the newer plantings during the dry spells that the desert delivered without apology. The horses had settled entirely. Slate, who had been Tamsin's earliest and most reliable indicator of when the herd situation was deteriorating, had returned to her usual habits, grazing in the east corner of the corral in the morning, standing at the gate in the evening, conducting her ongoing assessment of everything in the yard with the cool authority of an animal that had been paying attention longer than anyone gave her credit for. Garrett Flint came by on the 4th day. He arrived in the late morning on a wagon with his wife Clara, which meant it was a social call with a request attached, because Garrett never brought Clara to a business conversation and never came without Clara to anything he was trying to make seem casual. Tamsin saw them from the yard and waited at the gate. Garrett was a square-built man with a red face and the habit of beginning sentences in a way that suggested he'd thought them through and then discovering halfway through that he hadn't. Clarice was small and sharp-eyed, and usually the more interesting part of the pair, though she let Garrett manage his own conversations without commentary except through her expression. Tamsin, Garrett said, climbing down with the energy of someone arriving somewhere he'd been anticipating. Hell of a thing, what you built here. Thank you, Garrett. Hell of a thing. he said again, which meant he was gathering himself. I was telling Clara, I was saying, that woman figured out something the rest of us missed, and there's no two ways about it. He looked at the fence. Now I've got a north section, you've probably seen it, runs along the creek bed, and after what happened the other night, I'm thinking timber's not the answer anymore. My whole north line was good timber, and it went down like it was kindling. I heard, she said, so I'm thinking he started. Clara caught Tamsin's eye briefly and gave nothing away, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. I'm thinking maybe you'd be willing to walk that section with me. Give me your opinion about whether the cactus would work there. Tamsin looked at him for a moment. I'm willing to do that, she said. When's a good time for you? He seemed slightly wrong-footed by the directness of it, as if he'd expected more negotiation and didn't know what to do with the absence of it. End of the week, he said. Friday morning? Friday morning, she agreed. Clara looked at the fence. Can I walk along it? She said, which was the first thing she'd said. Just to see it up close. Go ahead, Tamsin said. Clara walked the outer face of the north section, slowly, her hands clasped behind her back, leaning in at various points to look at the spine overlap between the staggered rows. She was doing what the previous owner had done when drawing the diagrams, trying to understand the geometry of it, the reason it worked. Tamsin watched her and found she liked the quality of that attention. It was a woman looking at something another woman had built and trying to understand it as a thing to be understood, not as something to have an opinion about. I'll walk your north section Friday, Tamsin said to Garrett. You'll want the mule and the wagon ready. I'll tell you what to look for in the ravines on your property. Much appreciated, he said, and he meant it. And the complicated thing about Garrett was that he did mean it. Most of the time he was not a bad man. He was just a man who defaulted to assumptions about who had useful knowledge and who didn't, and the assumptions had never particularly served him. They left, and Tamsin went back to her work. By the end of the second week, 3 things had happened that she hadn't specifically planned for. The first was that Bram had started his South Range fence and had come by twice with questions she'd answered at the gate. Practical and specific questions about root behavior and soil reading that told her he was doing the work himself, rather than directing his hands to do it, which she found interesting. The second was that a woman named Perdita Morse, who ran a small horse operation on the eastern edge of Cinder Mesa, had ridden out unannounced to ask about the fence, and had stayed for 2 hours, and had left with a copied diagram and notes that Tamsin had written out for her on the back of a supply list. The third was that the journal had started to wear more noticeably from handling the pages she'd referenced. Most were beginning to show the soft edges of paper that had been touched many times. She bought a new leather notebook in town and began transferring H's diagrams and notes into it in her own hand. She added her own notes alongside the adjustments she'd made, the failures in the first placements that she'd had to correct, the observations about root behavior in different soil types based on the variance she'd encountered across the fence's length. It was slow work, and she did it in the evenings after the day's tasks were done, sitting at the table under the lamp with both notebooks open, building something from one into the other. She didn't know what she was building exactly. She had not set out to write anything. But TH had done the same thing once, sitting somewhere at the same kind of table with the same kind of lamp. And whatever H had left behind had saved her homestead. That felt like a reason to be careful. Complete. Mabel came on a Tuesday evening, third week, and found Tamsin at the table with both notebooks and asked what she was working on, and Tamsin explained it, and Mabel looked at the 2 open books for a long moment. That's more than one fence, Mabel said. I know. That's the whole method. Written out for anyone to use. That's the idea. Mabel sat down at the table and looked at the notebooks. She looked at the original journal and the new one beside it, the older handwriting, and the newer one that was different, but answering it. What are you going to do with it when it's finished? Tamsin hadn't decided. She knew she would share it, that had been decided, before she consciously made the decision, in the same way some decisions made themselves before you caught up to them. The question was how. She thought about Perdita Morse and the 2 hours at the gate, and about Bram's new notebook with the copied diagrams, and about Garrett walking his north section on Friday, and she thought about how much time each one of those interactions had taken, and how many more there would be. I might leave a copy at your store, she said finally, for people to look at. Copy from if they want. Mabel looked at her with an expression that was warm and dry at the same time, which was Mabel's characteristic register. I think that would be a considerable thing, she said. It's not mine to keep, Tamsin said. I didn't invent it. I just figured out it worked. You figured out it worked by doing it, Mabel said, which is different from just knowing it worked. Tamsin thought about that. Both matter, she said. TH figured it out, too. They just left before they could share it. You didn't leave, Mabel said simply. That landed in a particular way that Tamsin let sit for a moment without covering it. She hadn't left. That was the whole thing. Really, the whole story compressed down to its smallest true statement. She had not left. She had stayed, and the staying had required the fence, and the fence had required 8 days of knowing something she hadn't known on day 1. And now here she sat with 2 notebooks and blistered palms that were healed, and a claim that was filed, and land that was hers. She had not left. No, she said, I didn't. Friday she rode to Garrett's north section with him and spent the morning walking the creek bed line, looking at the soil, checking the draws for cactus stands. She found 3 sections with good planting potential and marked them with stones while Garrett walked alongside. And she explained what she was seeing. He asked better questions than she'd expected, which she noted and adjusted to. He had been thinking about it, turning the method over in his head since his visit, and some of the assumptions she'd expected to clear away had already been cleared. At one point he stopped at a stretch of the creek bed and looked at it and said, without particular preamble, I told 2 people, you'd probably sell by now. After the corral went down, she stopped walking. I know, he said, looking at the ground. I'm telling you because you'll hear it from somewhere, and I'd rather you hear it from me. She stood on the creek bank and looked at the water line, the dark stain on the earth that marked where water had run in the last rain, weeks ago. Garrett stood nearby, not quite looking at her. What made you think that? She said. Not an accusation, a genuine question. He considered it. Thought the numbers didn't work, he said. For a woman on her own, the labor, the cost, he stopped. I thought the numbers didn't work. They nearly didn't, she said, but they did. They did. She started walking again. The numbers don't always decide it. Sometimes it's what you do when the numbers look wrong. He walked beside her and didn't say anything for a while, which she had come to understand was Garrett's version of considering something carefully. He was not a man who showed his thinking while it was happening, which was different from not thinking. I'll start the east section first, he said eventually, looking at the planting area she'd marked. That soil's better. Get something established there, and then move to the harder sections when I know what I'm doing. That's exactly right, she said. Start where you can succeed and build confidence before you move to the hard ground. He looked at her. Is that what you did? No, she said. I started on the hardest ground I had and nearly didn't finish. I'm telling you what works, so you don't have to figure it out the same way I did. He seemed to turn that over for a moment, and then he nodded in the slow way of someone accepting an answer that was more honest than what they'd expected. She rode home in the early afternoon and found a horse at her gate. She didn't recognize a roan mare well kept, tied with a careful knot. She looked at the horse and then at the porch and found a woman sitting on her step. Young, maybe 25, with the particular tensed around, the edges looks of someone who had come to ask something they weren't sure they'd get an answer to. Miss Rowe? The woman said, standing up. Yes. My name is Elsie Croft. My husband and I have a claim about 12 miles south. She was holding her hat in her hands, turning it by the brim. We lost most of our fencing, last month different situation from the herd. A wash flooded and took the posts. We've got the animals in a temporary pen right now, but it won't hold through another month and we can't afford to replace what we had. She stopped. I heard about your fence, about what it did. Bram Huxley told my husband about it. Tamsin looked at her, took in the tired lines around her eyes, and the way she held her hat and the very specific quality of the posture of someone who has thought about making this trip for a while before they made it. Come inside, Tamsin said. I'll make coffee and show you the notebook. Elsie Croft stayed for 3 hours. She was sharper than her nervous arrival had suggested once the coffee was on the table and the notebook was open. She asked precise, practical questions and wrote down the answers in her own small notebook that she'd brought without being asked, which told Tamsin that she'd known she was coming here to learn something and had prepared to learn it. She asked about the mule injury and how Tamsin had adjusted. She asked about the caliche hardpan and the digging bar. She asked about what happened if a column didn't root properly in the first week. You'll know, Tamsin said. It goes soft at the base. A little lean that wasn't there when you planted it. Pull it, reset it, flood the base again, and pack the soil tighter. How many did you have to redo? 4, Tamsin said. 3 in the first 2 days before I understood the packing, 1 later when I rushed a plant that I should have taken more time with. Elsie wrote it down. And you finished in 8 days. 8 days, alone, mostly alone. Elsie looked at the notebook and then at Tamsin with an expression that was complicated in the way that the expressions of people who were running out of options were complicated, grateful, and desperate, and slightly undone by the idea that something they'd needed might actually exist. I have my husband, she said. He's strong. He'll do the work if I show him the method. Then show him, Tamsin said. The drawing's clear. The margin notes are what matter most. Read those first, before the diagram. T.H. put the mistakes in the margins, not in the main drawing. Elsie looked at the journal. Who is T? I don't know, Tamsin said. Whoever left this place before me. I've thought about it. She looked at the journal. I think they figured it out at the end. When they were already leaving, they didn't have time to try it on a large scale, but they knew the method worked and they left the notes. She paused. I've been glad for them every day since I found this page. Elsie left with copied diagrams and 4 pages of notes in Tamsin's handwriting, which was now the 3rd set of copied notes she'd made for someone in 3 weeks. She stood at the gate and watched Elsie ride south and felt something she didn't have a precise name for, not pride exactly, which was too self-directed, and not satisfactions exactly, which was too complete. Something in between. The feeling of a thing moving that was supposed to move. The weeks that followed arranged themselves into a shape that was recognizable as a life rather than a crisis, which was a distinction Tamsin had almost forgotten existed. She worked the homestead. She tended the fence, which was becoming less maintenance-intensive as the older columns settled in, and the roots went deeper. She rode Slate most mornings along the property line, and sometimes beyond it, relearning the land at something other than emergency pace. Noticing things she'd been moving through too fast to see, the shift in vegetation at the edge of the dry wash, the tracks of night animals in the soft ground below the limestone outcrop, the way the light hit the desert floor in the hour before noon and made everything look like it was underwater. She fixed the things that had been waiting to be fixed during the 8 days of the fence, a hinge on the outbuilding door, a section of the east corral fence that had been leaning since winter. The pet were dark, a patch on the roof over the kitchen corner that had been letting in a hairline of light that she'd been telling herself she'd get to. She got to it. She did it herself, the way she did most things, with the combination of patience and stubbornness that had become her primary working method. Bram's South Range fence came along slowly. He came by twice with questions and once with an observation about root behavior that was genuinely interesting. He'd noticed that the columns he'd planted on slightly elevated ground were establishing faster than the ones in the flat, and had a theory about drainage that Tamsin thought was probably right. She told him so. He received the assessment with the particular caution of a man who was not yet fully comfortable being told. He was right by someone he'd previously dismissed, but was getting better at it. You should write that down, she said. What you're seeing with the drainage. Put it in your notebook. He looked at his hands. I'm not much of a writer. You don't need to be, she said. Just describe what you're seeing. Drainage on elevated planting sites. Faster root establishment. That's the whole note. Future you or someone else will figure out why it matters. He looked at the fence section he'd been working on 3 weeks in. It was already more substantial than she'd expected. He worked steadily, which she hadn't anticipated. She'd expected him to direct his hands to do it and supervise. Most of its windows were dark. Instead, he was out there himself, which said something about what the night the herd came through had done to his relationship with the method. Stopped treating it as someone else's idea and started treating it as something he needed to understand from the inside. I'll write it down, he said. She left him to it. The copy she'd made for Mabel's store was completed on a Sunday evening, the whole method laid out in 12 pages with diagrams redrawn clearly, the spacing measurements in the margins, and Maut's notes about failures included with the same weight as the notes about what worked. She rode it to town on Monday morning and set it on the store counter. Mabel looked at it. Read the first page, standing at the counter with her reading glasses on. Read the second, looked up. This is good work, she said. It's TH work with my additions, Tamsin said. TH wouldn't have added the additions, Mabel said. Those come from doing it. Tamsin looked around the store, the familiar smell of it, flour and leather, and the particular dry sweetness of dried goods in a desert climate. She'd been coming into this store for 3 years, buying exactly as little as she could manage, making every purchase decision against the specific constraint of not quite having enough. The store looked the same as it always had, and so did Mabel, and yet something about standing in it now was different, in a way she was still adjusting to. I want to look at the seed section, she said. Mabel gestured. Tamsin went to the seed wall and stood in front of it for longer than she'd allowed herself to stand in front of it before. She was planning for next season rather than just surviving the current one, which was a different kind of thinking longer, less urgent, with the particular possibility in it that came from having a future you were actually planning toward rather than just trying to reach. She chose 3 varieties she'd been wanting to try for 2 years and paid for them at the counter. Mabel put its windows were bag without comment at, but Tamsin caught the small change in her expression, the thing Mabel allowed herself when something went the way she'd hoped it would. Say something, Tamsin said. I'm not saying anything, Mabel said. You're thinking something loudly. Mabel the bag closed. I'm thinking that the last time you were in here, you spent 12 minutes deciding whether to buy 1 packet of seeds because you were calculating whether you could trade the labor against the return. Tamsin took the bag, and now I bought 3. And now you bought 3, Mabel said, without calculating for 12 minutes. Tamsin looked at the bag in her hands. 3 seed packets. It was not a dramatic thing. It was not a flag planted or a victory speech or a visible symbol of anything. It was 3 seed packets in a cloth bag from Mabel's store, and the reason she'd been able to buy them without the 12-minute calculation was because she had a homestead that was claimed and fenced and functional and filing with enough margin that she could think about next season as something to plan for rather than something to survive. Fence had done that. 8 days. 190 feet. An old journal left by someone who hadn't stayed. Blisters on both palms and a lame mule and a man on a horse calling it a fool's garden, and 4 hours of sleep on the nights she was lucky, and 3 on the nights. That was what the 3 seed packets cost. She walked home. The late season afternoon was doing what late season desert afternoons did softening the light until it turned the landscape into something almost kind, the hard edges going amber and the shadows stretching east in long shapes across the desert floor. She walked slate at an easy pace, the cloth bag tied to the saddle, and she let the mare choose the run over the familiar road while her own mind moved through things at the same easy pace. She thought about Elsie Croft and her husband 12 miles south, probably hip-deep in Kalish by now, probably figuring out the same things she'd figured out on day 2, except with the notes to tell them what they were looking for. She thought about Bram on his south range, writing down observations about drainage in his own handwriting. She thought of Garrett Flint's section and Perdita Morse and the copied diagrams traveling through the settlement in ways she couldn't fully track. She thought about T.H., who had figured out the method alone and left the notes on a shelf and ridden away from a claim that hadn't made it, and whose name she still didn't know and probably never would. She thought about what it meant to build something that lasted after you were done building it. At her gate she dismounted and led Slate through, and the mare went directly to the water trough and drank, while Tamsin stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the fence. 5 weeks since she'd planted the last column. The cactus had changed in that time in ways that were subtle and cumulative. The columns she'd planted first had grown slightly taller, the spines had thickened, and where the staggered rows overlapped, the interlocking pattern had deepened into something that was no longer a collection of individual plants so much as a continuous surface. The living wall that the journal had described was becoming the thing it had been described as, and the process was slow enough that you had to have been watching to see the change, but she had been watching. She had been watching every morning. She unsaddled Slate and brushed her down, and the mare stood easy under the brushstrokes, with her eyes half closed in the last of the day's warmth, and Tamsin worked the brush in long even strokes and thought about nothing in particular for a while, which was its own kind of luxury, the luxury of a mind that didn't have to solve an immediate problem, that could move without a destination for a few minutes and not lose anything by doing it. She fed the horses and checked the corral. 11 horses, same as always. She counted them the way she always counted them, every evening, not because she expected the number to be different, but because the habit was the point, the daily accounting, the daily verification that what you'd built was still there. 11. She went inside and put the seeds on the table next to the journal, which had come back from Bram on the same day she'd started the copy for Mabel's store. She looked at the two things side by side. The old journal and the 3 seed packets. The thing that had saved what she had and the thing she was going to grow it into. She made dinner and ate at the table without reading or planning, just sitting in the quiet of the kitchen in the evening with the lamp going and the desert cooling outside and the horses settled in the corral. The sounds of the homestead moved around her, the mule shifting in his pen, the slight creak of the outbuilding in the evening breeze, the distant nothing of the desert doing what the desert did when people stopped demanding things from it. This was the thing she'd been working towards, though she couldn't have named it on day one. Not just the claim being secured, not just the fence being built. This, the evening quiet, the seeds on the table, the horses in the corral. The work settling into something that would last through seasons rather than barely surviving the current one. This was what 3 years of hauling water and repairing fences and enduring drought and reading old journals by lamplight had been in service of. A place, hers. She washed the plate and blew out the lamp and went to the door and stood there in the dark the way she sometimes stood at the end of the day, not looking at anything in particular, just present in the space of the homestead, with the fence out there in the dark and the stars doing their desert thing. Overhead, too many of them and too bright. The way they were, in country, with no competing light. The fence stood. She couldn't see it precisely in the darkness, but she knew its shape the way she knew the shape of her own hands from having touched every part of it, from having put it there one column at a time. In the dark it was a presence rather than a visible thing, the same way the land was a presence, so the same way years of work were a presence rather than something she could point to and show anyone. You couldn't really show someone what it had cost. You could show them the fence, and the fence was good, and the fence would keep standing and keep growing and keep doing what it did. But the cost of it lived in her hands and her back, and the 4 years of pre-dawn mornings and the specific loneliness of working alone in hard country when everyone around you has already decided how your story ends. She didn't need anyone to know the cost. She knew it. That was enough. Out in the corral, Slate moved once a single shift of weight, hooves on hardpack, the sound of a large animal adjusting to its own comfort, then silence again. Tamsin stood in the doorway a moment longer. Then she went inside and closed the door, and the desert went quiet around the homestead, and the living fence stood in the dark and grew.